City College started bringing their students, humanities class, down to Dharma Bums. And so every year we've had their students come down and share space, initially downtown and then here. And these, I've never met two people, I'm speaking to both of you because to me you're separate but you're the same, that just love the students more than anything in the world. And as someone who sat with their students for 15 years, you see that from the students. So and your journey is amazing. It's incredible. As you'll hear, it's a miracle you're even here. So thanks for being here. I'm honored and I'm glad you can have this experience with these crazy folks. So,
thank you. Jeff, thank you so much.
That's for sure.
Honor to be here, and thanks everybody for coming out on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. My son asked me, how many people do you think will be there? I said, I don't know if anyone's going to come. It's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so thank you all for being here. And before I read a couple things, and I'll leave some time if folks have questions. Before you go, my wife Kelly back there has some, just as a gift, you can have a copy of this book. So on the way out, Kelly's got a bag, and you can grab them. And if you feel like any kind of recompense is necessary, donate a few bucks to the temple. So just wanted to say that first. So this is a story I had about a year and a half ago. I almost died, actually 5 times. And it's really about what I learned through that process. And I'll say this, as Jeff was mentioning, I teach, and I teach Buddhism in the class, and I've taught for a long time, and there's a lot of lessons intellectually that I thought that I knew, and really what I want to kind of talk about tonight a bit through some of this writing in a couple poems is what I learned more experientially. And there's a big difference, I think, in many ways. So I'll start with this, and it's something that I wrote called Learning How to Die and Live Again. We come and go every day. Scores of us are born and scores of us die. There's nothing special about it. Last year, I almost died of acute liver failure when my immune system turned on itself. All my systems were collapsing. I was having trouble moving, eating, even thinking. I lay awake in the dead of night, listening to the coded alerts in the hospital, some signifying births, others indicating more grim outcomes. In my wing, I heard screaming, rustling, cursing, moaning, and weeping leak in from the near distant and distant rooms. Then, discordantly, the nursery rhyme announcing a delivery. It was a dance of life and death. In the time immediately before my transplant surgery, my wife read poetry to me in a tender voice and stroked my forehead. My son held my hand. I was hours away from dying, and I almost did. At one point, you're asked to sign a document indicating that you know you could die from the procedure. What was your religious preference? Who gets to make decisions for you? There's nothing like being wheeled away from your loved ones for what could be the last time, feeling the last kiss, the last touch of a hand, getting the last sight of their faces, and hearing the last loving farewell. Tears do not convey the depth of the grief or the desperation of the hope. I remember quite vividly the hallway on the way to the operating room as strangers were wheeling me toward an uncertain fate, the bright lights and the blank ceiling, the slow, steady movement of the gurney, being enveloped in the bustle and white noise lends the passage from room to room a surreal intensity. I was keenly aware of everything, watching it all living it all, breathing in, breathing out, again and again and again. You are there and not there, vanishing into a liminal space where you finger the edge of death as you wait for the unspeakable gift of the unspeakable grace of a gift from a dead person, their family mourning as you wait in limbo for hours to see if another person's organ can save your life. The room is antiseptic and packed with a myriad of machines and surgical devices. People's voices are calm and serious. Things are explained to you. Then you drift into blankness, a purgatory from which you may or may not emerge. You can't control anything, so you surrender, yield to whatever fate awaits. Every year, close to 2,000 people die waiting to get this chance at a second life. Last year, a record 10,666 people received liver transplants, 1,089 in California. Of my fellow travelers, about 25% die soon after the procedure or within 5 years. And, my wife looked up, during the period too, the number of people who are in my precise situation, 85% of them die. So making it to the 1 year mark is a big deal. It means I'm more likely to join the 75% of people who survive 5 years or longer. Many take much more than that, but how much longer? I don't know, but then again, neither does anyone. It would be foolish to bank on something other than what is here at this very moment. Of course, I'm deeply grateful for the stranger's gift and the compassion, care, and support of many others. I stop and sit and return to the touchstone of that space of suffering, absolute leveling, and deep humility as often as I can. I savor its rawness and want only to, as Thoreau said, suck the marrow out of life from here on in. Thus, I return home to life rather than the mindless death in life that we so often confuse with living. My recovery also took every ounce of courage, discipline, and tenacity I had to crawl my way back to health. It was ass-kickingly grueling, sometimes humiliating and brutalizing every day, with lots of new obstacles, setbacks, and unforeseen challenges. It was, as one nurse put it, like someone dropped a nuclear bomb on my life as it was, and I had to start over. But I don't have any Horatio Alger stories for you, no triumphant affirmations or tales of miraculous transformation. Apologies, dear listeners. I already had a tragic sense of life and done what I could to love others and live in the moment. What happens to you, though, when you almost die is that your sense of yourself is utterly shattered. It's one thing to think of what you mean when you say I as a philosophical construct. It's quite another thing to lose it entirely and to have to grope your way back from the fiction of you to perilously navigate a course in order to pull into the port of your illusory self, struggling all the while to stand on shaky legs on ground that is always shifting under your feet. The key to not fearing this moment is to realize that there has never been any ground to stand on. There is no you and me because, as Shunryu Suzuki says, what I call I is just a swinging door. Our breath comes in and goes out, inside and outside, coming and going. Days, hours, seconds, waking and falling to sleep, sunrises and sunsets, pain and pleasure, agony and ecstasy, they arise and they fall again. It all passes through us and makes us and unmakes us. Every sound, taste, feeling, smell are part of the all-encompassing music of always dying and becoming. Clarice Lispector put it this way: I'm joyful in this very instance because I refuse to be defeated, so I love. As an answer, impersonal love, love, even the love that ends. And my own death and that of those we love must be joyful. I don't know how, but they must be. That is living, the joy of the it. Every pitch in the ball game matters. There is never a moment that it is not there to be savored. The beautiful mystery in the eyes of others, the madness and magic of crowds, the lonely, still, quiet at dawn. It's all there, all the time. I remember for weeks after my surgery, fighting to roll out of bed, get dressed, and push myself fast enough to arrive at the hospital before the lab opened for my blood tests. Just do one thing, I'd say to myself. Just this one thing. I slid down the stairs on my bottom and trembled through each step with the aid of a walker as I made my way to the front door and then to the street, across the street to my car. In the cool gray morning, just after dawn, I would listen to the first song on the last Wilco album that had become unintentionally the soundtrack to my life. When it got to the chorus, I smiled through tears. It's good to be alive. It's good to be alive. It's good to know we die. It's good to know. Infinite surprise, infinite surprise, infinite surprise, infinite surprise. And after the blood test, I willed myself back out to the car, drove home and sat with a cup of coffee on my porch, each sip like a sacrament, as I listened to the bird song and watched the sun slowly break its way through the clouds to illuminate the green leaves on the trees and sparkle on the morning dew on the little patch of grass right there in front of me. So that's, something I wrote on a 1-year anniversary of this all happening. And just a little bit more, I'll just read a couple poems and then sort of open it up if folks have any questions or comments or discussion. But a little bit more about that kind of experience itself. Really, I was traveling in Maui, right? So in one of the most sort of beautiful places you can imagine. When I was diagnosed with this thing, and the doctor kind of bluntly said, well, it's either congestive heart failure or liver failure. Pick your poison, right? So you go home and do the Googling and you're like, okay, my odds aren't good. So the first few poems in this slim volume were about sitting, because I had to wait until I could get a plane back. And just coincidentally, one of my best friends is a liver specialist in LA who works partially also at UCLA. And he sent the drugs without which I could not have made the flight across. So there's like near-death brush number one. Then I went from the airport directly to the hospital, and then they got me on medication, hoping maybe things would go well. They did a biopsy, blew the biopsy, had to wait to get a second biopsy. And so in the process of about 5 weeks, I went to the point where when they finally got the biopsy, they said, okay, you're going to the hospital. And I was within 24 hours of dying. To the point really where there was a doctor that actually wanted to move me from one floor to the other because he didn't think I was really dying enough. And then the team of people who, I owe them a lot, but as I owe my friend a lot, but the team argued with him and said, no, it's really that close. And so I stayed where I was and had the surgery, and then after the surgery, so the second poem, so the first poem I read will be from Hawaii, the second poem will be the day of the surgery. And then you're thinking, okay, I'm in the clear, things are looking up, and then I had a toxic reaction to the medication that they give you to suppress your immune system so the liver stays in you. And I had, 3 massive big seizures and almost died a couple more times then. And then by the end of the fall, I was feeling much, much better, thinking I'm on the rise, and then I got some sort of strange infection and woke up spitting large amounts of blood out and wound up having to get a couple procedures, in Kaiser, and finally they got me enough antibiotics and various drugs of all sorts to abate this, and the interesting thing about this whole saga, and it's just about a year from that last experience this week, is that they never knew what caused the liver failure, and they don't is the last thing, so I'm out living this dream. I'm both the unluckiest and luckiest man alive in many ways. So, there you go. So the first poem's in Hawaii, the second poem is the day of, and then there's some poems about that other stuff, and then the final one. They're brief. The first one is called The Imperfect Now. Trembling in paradise, I sit in a chair in the shade, looking out the window at the expanse of green grass rolling toward the silver road of the sun, glittering on the deep blue ocean. There is nothing left anymore, no dreams of a brighter future, no roads yet to be taken, just this imperfect now, the cool breeze on my face, a catamaran in the distance with its white sails pushing against the rising waves. The palm trees are bowing to the wind, and the sound of the ceaseless surf is operatic. My body aches in 1,000 places, and the nausea is raging within, but my eyes still take delight in the tender glimpses of the radiant world. A turtle's head pops up and gasps for air, and the silhouette of frozen lava is framed by the boundless sea. I should drown myself in this pain and longing, and be reborn, diffuse, surging and flowing from matter to emptiness, part of the nothing that is inside the billowing clouds that aimlessly roam the sky and make the poetry of the day's last light sing before it dies gently in the darkness, like the first words of a prayer. Into the Bardo, after Pema Chödrön. During the dawning hours, I struggled to sleep, failing to catch even a stray minute of peace. Throughout it all, my nurse, Jeff, said to me in his calm, steady voice, "Go with the river. You can't fight the river. Go with the river." He repeated it over and over like a mantra, and his words stayed with me throughout the night, into the early morning, and onward to this day. Before they came to take me to the surgery, I said to my son, "If I don't make it, remember to look at your hand, and I'll be there always." My wife wiped away my tears, kissed me, and as they wheeled me down the hallway, I recalled what I told my son the day before as I cradled his head in my hands. "Be not afraid, have courage, and be steadfast." But in my gut, I was sure I would die. Death was smiling at me in the darkness, waiting patiently by my side, whispering to me that it was time to pass over, quietly and quickly, to his lonely kingdom. "It will be a delicate and difficult procedure," I heard the surgeon say in the operating room, thinking that I'd already gone under. So I lay there on a razor's edge. Now I knew I had no time to waste. Not one moment more. My body had been screaming this for months, but now the doctors knew it too, as they spoke in a semi-whisper. "Let's start the procedure." As the anesthesia took hold, I occupied a space between life and death, tiptoeing along the border, trying to impose a semblance of order on my inner chaos. I held tightly to the discipline of just breathing in and out, deeply and slowly, and letting whatever came to be sit there as it was. Suddenly, I reached a strange state of grace and went blank. My last thought before the 6-hour Caesura was of teaching Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place in a classroom with a view of a distant tree, shedding a few reluctant autumn leaves in the soft breeze. And then deep nothingness suspended from time. Still lying on my back, I came to consciousness, furtively, eyes closed, silently repeating to myself a line from Pema Chödrön. "How we live is how we die," which I seamlessly replaced with the memory of my nurse slowly guiding me forward. Don't fight the river, go with it. You can't fight the river, let it flow through you. Amen. Crown of Thorns. I spent days in a prison-like bed, hemmed in by high padded side rails and an alarm set to go off if I left without a nurse. Both of my arms were hooked up to IVs or monitors. My head was tethered to a wall behind it by a cord connected to dozens of electrodes attached to my freshly shaven skull, providing a continuous stream of images of brain activity to a computer monitor by my enclosure. At one point, I made the mistake of looking at myself in a monitor, and as Melville said of Ahab, there was a crucifixion in his face. Indeed, after months of taking what the same old courage teacher called the universal thump, I was humbled, leveled, and laid low as I'd ever been. I, too, had seen the dark patches where those lonely, wandering souls on our streets live every day, finding no place of solace or refuge, lurching between terror and rage. This was my crown of thorns, not knowing if I'd ever occupy my right mind again, whether I would ever read, write, or concentrate with focus. Would I be set adrift forever? After days of this, I left the hospital, sitting numb and defeated in the passenger seat. I was only reached by the visage of another abandoned soul, sitting in a wheelchair on the street outside the ER, still wearing a frayed hospital gown and holding a sign that simply said, "Help." I'll read one last one. What was it like? So what was it like almost dying? It was like falling out of the world, away from the vast horizons and the loving embrace of crowds of beautiful strangers, the books of their lives written on their faces, losing sight of the gorgeous monsters of city and the paths you take away from them to the shade of old trees and the greenness of grass growing amidst weathered stones. It was like tumbling away from myself into small spaces and rooms, a spot on a bed, hours of the false comfort of sheets and warm covers, then slowly, bit by bit, losing strength, sleep, good humor, hunger, and worst of all, desire. It was watching myself recede, losing grasp of my mind, my hold over sentences, the intimate touch of words and concentration, becoming nothing but breath and sight and bottomless grief, like falling down a hole with no way out as the voices of my beloveds grew faint in the distance. It was the blank stillness of night with the only sound, my heart pounding fiercely. It's arriving at a place where you realize that you control nothing, not your body, your emotions, your mind. Helpless and trembling, you shiver at the emptiness at your core, the realization that you have no core, but instead are a dry, fallen leaf floating on the surface of a restless river, gliding until you sink and are just the river, or really a speck of the atomic soup of water, or what we think is water, rather than merely a part of the flow of things beyond time. Underneath the fear, there is surrender and release, not so much ecstasy or joy, but abandon and drift. You are simply not there. And how did it feel to live again? It was amazement at the sweetness of apple juice, the delicious bite of bitter coffee blended with the sharpness of 1,000 needle pricks in my arm, and the feel of my stapled torso. It was loving the texture of all that we feel, even the mysterious contours of pain. It was the touch of my lover's hand, the smell of my son's hair as he bent over me, the taste of the thick salt of tears. It was struggling to sit up, so weak after losing 60 pounds in 6 days, being helped to eat slowly, and then, most important of all, to walk step after step on the cold tile floor of the hospital, the creaky hardwood of my house, and the broken pavement of the sidewalk outside, seeing the Mexican poppies blooming in the yard, hearing the whiz and twitter of hummingbirds, feeling the tender blades of grass underneath my bare feet. And as it went on, the world came back, one footstep at a time. The families at the taco shop, neighbors walking dogs, the huge, unruly ficus in the park, where the lawn is full of rabbits at dawn, hawks soaring across the canyon, and the ruins of the fountain by the pathway, the wings by the pathway that winds down the hillside, past a sea of orange flowers. It was holding my wife's hand in mine as my gait became steady, hearing the dirt crunch under the soles of my feet, and knowing that everything we need is always right here in front of us. So I'll stop with those, and I guess, I'll say a couple words and then see if anybody has comments or questions about anything. Jeff asked me to talk a little bit about kind of practice, and I hope you saw in the poems, kind of how that played, right? But the thing that I found, and this was actually kind of a bit of a surprise to me, because I've been sitting for, 20 some years, before Kelly and I even met Jeff, but it was really just my own idiosyncratic sort of form of practice. I read Thich Nhat Hanh and Chenrezig as a kid. Went into the store when I first met Jeff and bought, a cushion with my kid when he was this big. Now he's like 6'4", and I just sat, right, and just sort of by trial and error learned, came here, talked to other people who practiced, and I certainly don't think of myself as some kind of bodhisattva or anything, right? I teach, I work, I do what I do, and come home. But the thing that I found remarkable is how much that had sort of sunk in and enabled me to kind of lean into this experience, right? And just simple things like pain. The way in which, when you read, and this is, I could cite 6 different teachers, so I won't cite anyone, but the way in which, like, pain is just a feeling. And that you can sit with the pain and work your way through the pain until the back end of it, and then it's the next feeling after that feeling. There's a certain kind of undifferentiated experience that you can kind of have that's very useful. It doesn't mean that you don't suffer, but it is very, very useful. And just simple things, right? Like, his name is falling out of my head now, but there's a fellow who writes a lot of books about kind of the medical uses of meditation, particularly kind of Zen meditation. That's John Kabat-Zinn, right? And something that I found too remarkably is when it was really important for this to be the case, is just how I could lower my blood pressure up to 20 points by just sitting. I'd say to the nurse to stop for a second, give me 30 seconds, and just sit. And it would be high, and then it would come back down. So I was just a fairly interesting kind of empirical, experience of this sort of thing. So that helped, in very, very kind of practical ways, and in a certain sense, kind of able to find courage, and also this sort of sense of just like, when you're sitting in between waiting for somebody, like literally this last time, you're sitting in a place getting a test, where you get a shot of fentanyl in your neck, and then they're sticking tubes down your throat into your lungs as you're still awake, taking blood out and trying to find a spot. And how do you find it with the ventilator right there with the crew ready to stick you on it, just in case after you've signed your life away? One of those kind of fun experiences in your life, right? But just to kind of, the thing that I found is, while you're waiting for 2 days to get the diagnosis, of just like the thing that helped me the most, just simple compassion, right? Not thinking about me, but asking nurse, how are you doing? just that kind of like, how's your day been? Just thinking of the other person, the person cleaning the floor, the person bringing you food, that other person, right? That there's a certain sense of by reaching out of yourself that you're able to kind of, it's a profound and simple but profound kind of solace, I think, that you can find in those moments, right? Because the temptation is to go inward and then sort of cycle inward and sort of doom spiral, right? And when I found myself on the verge of doing that, I was reaching out, not that far, just the person right next to you, was as much as it took in many ways. So that's, I think, some of the ways in which that was the case. And then, the part that Jeff quoted for the post about this reading is, from Pema Chödrön, that book, the Bardo, the whole notion. I found that an incredibly useful sort of philosophical concept, right? And she's talking about specifically, there's a very specific Tibetan kind of Buddhist practice about, learning how to die and going through that process. But she makes it quite clear that it's also kind of a metaphor for daily experience as well, right? You can see this, the fact that, every day being born, every day dying, the transition and transience of everyday life and kind of leaning into that uncertainty, is also something that, I found to be quite useful and illuminating, right? Because the more you try to hold on and look for something, the less it's there. And even, kind of why write something like this and some of the columns, I've done some stuff that's been in the Tribune and other places around town. And the thing is, it's sort of like somebody asked me that, at the I did a reading in the book Catapult in South Park last week. And I said, well, trying to turn it into something that's useful for other people, right? And so the nicest thing about doing this and writing some of these things is getting notes back from people who had cancer or had somebody who survived cancer and said, that's it, you've nailed it, right? I feel I can see my experience in that. And that to me is really kind of like somebody's asking, well, how many books have you sold? I really don't care. In fact, I'm giving a lot of them away like today. It's really more about that kind of modest gift, right? Back to other people, back to the community, right? So that's, I think, some of the ways that, practice has sort of helped in that regard, right? And that's I think, something years and years and years of teaching, at City College and teaching a population of students where, you see a lot of pain. That's sort of something that kind of also, it's a kind of practice, I think, and seeing that, on a daily basis and then saying, kind of like, as I say in one of the poems, well, why not me, right? Now it's my turn, now I'm that person, right? And our son has cancer, he's a survivor, but, we've had a kind of long road of this kind of experience in our lives, but at a certain extent, as I say in the first piece I read, I like to keep my hand on that now. I kind of really don't want to drift back to a more, not necessarily a more stable, or to kind of, you'd say, normal life in that way, but I think the kind of rawness of that is very instructive. Keeping my hands on that, right? It makes things much richer, right? It makes every moment much richer. Everything from just like, the way the light catches the side of that piece of art as I'm sitting here talking to, people's faces, to, watching a cloud go by in the sky, to more profound social interactions with people, right? I find myself much more compelled by like my students, much more compelled by other people, and this sort of, Thanksgiving, right? Grateful for, the ability to still have this sort of second act, right? Because really this book, and I wrote another book of kind of collection of stuff I've written over 40 years, also poetry, and those, I wrote them both not knowing I'd be alive when I wrote them. It was sort of just like a kind of like tossing it into the future, theoretically, right? And that's, I think, also just sort of like thinking about even art or writing really not so much as a transactional thing, but as a gift, So I guess I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Because you give somebody who teaches classes an hour, they'll easily fill up all the space with words, right? So, and any thoughts, questions, comments from anybody? Or have I silenced all of you?
First, thank you for sharing your life experience with us tonight. This is a more intellectual question, so please bear with me.
Sure.
So often in the very prevalent work now on neuroscience of contemplative practice, there is a step that's described where the practitioner is trained to be able to meditate inside the MRI machine because the scientists are afraid that the practitioner will somehow be unable to meditate when there's the noise of the machinery. So I was really drawn to the reality of how noisy hospitals are with beeps and machines, and especially surgery arenas. And I heard in you no disruption between your well-rooted practice being available to you and all the noise around you. So I was just curious if you would describe what it was like to uphold your practice in the noise.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there was a time, literally, like, I don't know, just imagine someone taking a big long nail and jabbing it into the middle of your head, right? I had these horrible, horrible headaches, right, during part of this process, right, and not like, for a couple hours and it goes away, like, all day, like 10 out of 10 pain, and I had to do MRIs, right, and one of the most sort of like, I highly recommend not doing an MRI when you have a headache. But here they are, they're wheeling me down the hallway, and I'm going in the MRI, and really all I can do is breathe. Because you just sort of, there's a certain part of you just feels like screaming, like, get me out of here, right? But I found, again, it was another one of those sort of moments where you're able to just breathe and stay with it. And I also had this experience, and I don't say this in any way like I have some kind of great enlightenment experience. In fact, one thing, there's another poem in here that's called Stars, which is about this moment when I was pretty sure that I was going to recover, right? And it's when I was sitting in the back room trying to, do you guys remember when we had that kind of near hurricane that came to San Diego 2 summers ago? Sitting there, and I remember sitting, and I had this transcendent moment where like everything opened up, right? And this feeling of radiance and well-being was there, and it totally makes sense. I think it's Chandra Suzuki, but don't quote me on this too, that says, yeah, don't pay attention to that because the next day it's going to be right. That is very much true, right? Because you're kind of trying to hold on to this and you're saying, wow, this was this amazing thing, whatever it was, but kind of like other people call it kind of openings. But through a lot of it, I just talked to my neurologist just a couple days ago. And I had this strange experience of this, and maybe it has something to do with the sitting. I don't know, but where I said, I remember all this stuff, and she was kind of like, wow, like the voices of the surgeons, all of this sort of stuff. And it was always kind of like through all of it, this kind of like the one who watches sort of, this part of myself that was watching myself like a movie as it was happening, so this kind of odd sort of, experience. And I think that it has to come in some way from practice. I think that whole experience and being in a place with, not just noise, but sometimes horrific noise. It was a way to kind of lean into the experience and not, I'm trying to think of a good way to put this, not surrender to heedlessness and the kind of chaos of the moment. It's not a Buddhist idea, but there's a certain kind of Hemingway idea, grace under pressure. right? What do you do when, everything around you, you feel like you're falling apart, everything is falling apart, and not just the physical you, but your mental, because they're part, there's pictures of me in the hospital where it says, do not lower bed, because if I did, my brain swelling was so bad that I could have lost my capacities, as they say, completely, right? So it was terrifying, but how do you kind of face psychological, physical, and other things well? Just that kind of simple practice was a way to kind of block out that inner noise and then the kind of larger noise of the place itself. So I found it incredibly useful. And that's not to say at all that, I didn't have bad moments or anything. I did, right? I don't need to present it that way at all, but, almost dying 5 times in 6 months is a relatively unique experience. So, from that perspective, I feel like one of the ways that I kind of came through it, largely whole, I guess I'm largely whole, is through that.
I'm not going to put words in your mouth because I know better than that. Was it a sort of presentness that you got from the breathing?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What?
Presentness. Yeah, just a kind of grounding, a kind of solidity. But there was another hint too. I don't know. I hope that answered that.
Yes, thank you for sharing. And while you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about autoimmunity, and you were speaking a bit about early on about the dissolution of the self. And I wondered if autoimmunity is something you have thought about with regards to this, or if you could just say more about this sense of dissolution, if that makes sense.
Just in terms of the autoimmune, how that, you mean what happened to my body specifically, or?
I guess I mean I feel like we think of illness as an outside invader coming to attack, and autoimmunity kind of messes with this because it's your own body attacking yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense. This is just what I was thinking about when you were talking about. I know I keep saying the dissolution. There's just this.
No, but I think that kind of the barrier between self and other, the barrier between yourself and everything else, right? That's something that I think I did think about a lot, obviously from the poems, right? And that whole idea of I said a lot, just imagining not being here. That was one, and I did it then too. And the whole idea of thinking about a lot about your body just being part of kind of a larger. It's like the whole idea of happy continuation day. You're always being born, always dying, right? That there's that kind of sense in which that seems scary, but it's also liberatory. From a Western standpoint of the solid self that's impermeable and, stuck in place, it's terrifying. It's kind of switching into kind of my teacher mode, sort of when Heidegger talks about what's human nature like, he says, oh, it's like thrownness. You wake up, oh, what happened to me, right? Or the famous painting by Munch, the kind of the scream, right? The whole idea of the existentialist sort of view of nothingness is full of terror, right? But in the East, nothingness is greeted with an entirely different sort of perspective, right? So it's kind of nothing, the kind of the matter and the nothingness are kind of these interrelated things, right? They're inside of each other, So I thought a lot about that, about kind of what makes up the body, and just how this self is very much in flux all the time. And to me, that intellectually speaking, again, is a very elegant idea. It's one of the things that sort of drew me toward Buddhism intellectually, because just intuitively it made sense to me, right? That whole idea of kind of constant flux, the transient nature of all things, right? But from a kind of perspective of thinking about you could not be here, what would be left of you? You know, I just love that line I stole, which is really a Thich Nhat Hanh sign that I said to my son, look at your hands, right? We're all part of each other at a kind of fundamental atomic level, right? You know, but it's also Whitman, right? Sorry, no, anybody take an American Whitman class in here? You know, exactly. Every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, right? You know, I shall filter and filter your blood. You know, that idea of kind of the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, the interpenetration of all things at the fundamental kind of atomic level, right? And lots of people have written about this with regard to subatomic physics too, right? Reality itself, matter, is a fluid event, right? So there's this kind of parallel between some Buddhist thinking and even sort of high physics in a lot of ways. Like, you know, that's why Dalai Lama wrote a book about physics, that famous book, The Tao of Physics, right? That stuff's intellectually really fascinating sort of stuff, but sometimes when you're sitting, you can experience it at a way that's sort of beyond words in a way. So, great question. Those will, yes.
This is going to be an odd question. I don't know if you.
As I say in my class, there are no odd questions. There are none.
In your process of how you're explaining everything and putting it in basically a poetry form of faith or how you're relating to it, the one biggest question of everything you're going through, did you finally reach a point that you made peace with it?
With dying?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, just that part in the first poem, I was sure. I knew before the doctors did, I could feel it just inside. Knew that, like, I was not long for this world. Everyone was saying, oh, no, this is okay. The livers can repair themselves. There's all this. I'm like, no. My body was telling me absolutely that's not the case. And it turns out that I was correct. You know, so there was a part in which I really had to kind of sit there and, like, this poor guy. The first doctor that I had, you know, when I came back from Maui, I kept asking him, drilling down at the guy. You know, he's a young guy. He's got a medical school probably too. And I'm like, am I going to die? I need to know. Said, don't bullshit me. Am I going to die? Let me know. You know, and I got a son, I got a family, I got to talk to people, I got to come to terms with this, right? You know, I got to face it. You know, and the guy's, oh no, there's this thing and that thing. Next day I'd ask him, okay. You know, so yeah, but that was part of my own sort of trying to come to terms with and sort of own it, right? And not look away from it as much as possible. You know, so there is a way in which I kind of felt, you know, I'm a year and a half out of like the closest brush, but you know, I still have a little bit sometimes a feeling of like coming back from the wilderness weirdly. Anybody who's had cancer and or got a death sentence and come back from it, right? It's just it's a blessing, but it's also a kind of, it's an odd, you know, odd experience in lots of ways. You see the world differently. So there was another hand here earlier. Yeah.
The way you described what it's being someone that's been there a couple of times is very poetic, but also very visceral of what that is. Thank you for that, because I can't ever have the words to describe to anybody what it's like to almost die and then to come back. The song "Hold On Loosely," if you've ever heard that song, comes to mind. Hold on loosely, don't let go. You know, but don't hold on too tight. So my question is, once you've been through something like that, and you said now the beauty of like sunlight, things like that means so much more. How do you hold on to that but not escalate or not, I'm not saying it, but not hold on too lightly, if that makes sense? Because there's a certain amount of we want to live and we want to enjoy and we want to be also at the same time aware of how change is inevitable, how easily we can slip through the, you know. How do you find that you now work that into your daily practice?
Wow, that's a great question. These are all like super easy to answer in 30 seconds questions again. But no, that's I just find like there's you know, because there's a certain sense in which I'll go back and kind of touch on that moment, and that brings a kind of texture and a kind of looseness to it. Like, when I read this, I actually, managed not to weep, but the first 2 times I read these poems, I was weeping. And you're just kind of like, well, I used to be like, in past, I'd be like, come on, you gotta control yourself, you gotta learn how to speak publicly. And that was kind of one of my big things when I was coming back from, because you have a huge amount of post-traumatic stress syndrome from, this kind of thing. So it was how to do that. And I really kind of come to not feel the slightest compunction about that, because there's something instructive about publicly showing people that vulnerability. And I think that I try to touch that, while still, you're kind of in the world, but not in the world in some ways. There's sort of like, when I'm at work and people are having a very, an unnecessary squabble about something that ultimately doesn't really matter. That's a lot easier for me now. And then it gets a lot easier not to get tied up into that and hold on to and that kind of stuff, and it's also, sometimes I think there's a certain kind of sense in which, like, the one thing that's hard is, like, there's certain things that the only thing that's really worth doing are things that really mean something. And yet, if you've got to make a living, right, you need to be out there and you got to do your job. So it's been trying to, and I would say this is a challenge, is like, how do I bring that perspective of the kind of the radiance of everyday life, right? The kind of beauty of that and the kind of tremblingly transient nature of it into, like, teaching my class, going to a meeting, dealing with somebody. Like, that's the big, for me, in terms of, like, if you believe in some of the fundamental precepts of Buddhism, fundamental intellectually, how do you bring that into everyday life? It's not like you're going to be a saint or something, right? But, like, how do you try to bring that into, like, the most ordinary aspects of how we live, as a lay person, right? And I guess my answer is I don't have a perfect answer for that yet. Because sometimes I'll feel badly if I kind of find myself drifting a little further away from that, right? But it's a challenge. I look at it as a kind of a motivation for me to kind of keep trying to integrate that into the parts of my life where it's the hardest to integrate. Any other questions, comments?
With me, please, as I try to form this question. You mentioned unhabit sins, bringing the Buddhist practice into Western medicine, and as the West has been benefiting from the different contemplative traditions, there seems to be a slower growing understanding of the nature of illness and health and the organs of the body in relation to all the states of mind and emotion. And I'm wondering if it feels comfortable to consider the extent to which, like, a Tibetan doctor's view of what was happening would be, and how my own experience of some Tibetan medical doctors offering a mantra in relation to an organ imbalance, and just that in the East there was no separation between meditation and medicine, and if that's been an area you've explored.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about the Kabat-Zinn stuff and things, like, and you can even see it, like, if you go to the San Diego Medical Center, there is, like, a meditation room, that they've kind of incorporated, even in, like, a Kaiser, right? So there has been a little bit of kind of, and the thing, I've actually been kind of pleased to see how, like, not hostile, or not dismissive, I should say, not necessarily hostile, but not dismissive, some of the medical doctors, either the liver people or, neurologists and all of that, because I had a whole conversation with a neurologist about meditation and stuff, and she talked about, like, how monks can, reach a certain degree where their brain functions in this sort of extraordinary way. She'd actually done some research, and there's papers written about that stuff, about, like, how you can deal with the default network structure, in your brain and all of that. So I think there's a real kind of interesting kind of, a lot of lessons to be learned from Eastern philosophy, that could be applied, to the West. And it's happening kind of slowly, but, I think you can see it manifest in some ways. Just in terms of, because I got at least 3 or 4 of the doctors I talked to themselves meditated. And these are people who deal with a lot of death. So I think it's kind of like, okay, well, this is a practice that maybe can help me go through my daily job and practice it well, but also have some sort of sense of solidity while I'm doing it, some sense of equanimity, in the midst of it. So I'm not sure if I'm precisely getting to that, but trying to get in the neighborhood. Right, you bet. Any other questions?
I don't really have a question, but
Sure.
I do want to thank you so much for sharing and sharing so beautifully. It was very touching for me. And it made me really start going back in my own history. And about 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with a tumor in the chamber of my heart. I said, oh, really? And I'd been a strong meditator, got started in TM, et cetera, et cetera. I was super fit at the time. And I go, oh, okay, well, what do we do about that? And they said, well, open heart surgery, which meant, they saw you in half. And I said, okay. And I'm looking back on that experience and going, I don't think I was ever afraid. And that surgery did not work. They had to do it again, and they had to do it again. So I had an open heart 3 times in 3 months, something like that. But in the hospital, I meditated and listened to audio tapes the whole time, unless I had visitors or whatever. And I really think that my meditation practice is what got me through the whole thing. And I never thought I was going to die. Everybody around me did, but here I am.
That's fantastic. That's great.
But I really appreciate what you've written, and it makes me want to go back and kind of, from today's perspective, look at it.
Yeah, and I know we've only got about a minute left.
Yeah.
I'll try to respect everybody's time, but that was, and thanks for your story. Thank you for sharing that, and that's been one of the most meaningful things for me, is hearing a lot of people. Like, I've published a column and get a lot of people saying, yeah, me too. This is exactly kind of the experience that I've had, and creating at least, a kind of virtual community of people sharing that experience, I think is meaningful, right? And just doing, pick up my prop for my story. But I mean, really what doing this was a certain kind of just writing it. I literally wrote this in hospital beds, recovering at home, and in other hospital beds, like by hand, sometimes with a laptop, and just the process of documenting it as I went. So it's pretty raw. I revised it to a degree, but it's kind of like my sort of journal of the damned and story of redemption, right straight as it was happening. Mostly because I always did write, but it was a way, writing itself as a kind of practice. Right, and that's the way that I thought about this collection, because this is all it is from beginning to that last time about a year ago, kind of does that. And I think there's something about that is, I was really never afraid of dying myself. I was afraid of leaving other people. if that makes any sense. That's the kind of grief or the sorrow that I experienced and still do experience, even remembering it, is this kind of, that's the thing, you know, that got to me. You know, in terms of just myself, it was less of a thing. So I know exactly what you mean, right? You know, I wasn't sort of afraid that way, but I felt great grief at the possibility of leaving my son, leaving my wife, leaving my family, leaving my, you know, close, you know, the beloved people in my life. You know, so yeah, that's interesting. And just that whole idea, really fundamentally, it's one thing to talk about compassion intellectually, it's another thing to kind of use it as a lived tool as much as possible. You know, I've tried to talk a little bit about that with my students sometimes too, and kind of like, you know, particularly when people are feeling upset, you know, about the world, you know, it's a useful tool to say, well, you know, just do what you can to build a community. Be kind to somebody right next to you. That's the first place to start. It's the first thing you can do. So with that, I'm just about at time, so I will end. Thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate it. Oh, and Kelly has books if anybody would like one. They're free.
Hello everyone, I am Allie, tonight's hosts. We opened the Dharma Bum Temple 18 years ago to introduce Buddhist practice to those who show up. Those who lead are not nuns, monks, gurus, masters, or teachers and are not looking for students. They are simply practitioners sharing their interpretation of the practice. Every night we have different classes led by different people from various Buddhist traditions. We have a recovery sangha that meets several times a week for anyone with addiction, and our food redistribution program is every Thursday at 4:30. We have classes and programs every day, and everything we offer here is always free. The full schedule is on our website and also posted in the entryway above the shoe rack. We have a lending library. If you see a book you like, feel free to borrow it and then bring it back whenever you're done with it. Please straighten your seat or cushion before you head out. If a few people could stay to close and latch the windows, that would be helpful. Thank you for being here. We wish you well and hope to see you all again.